Russia attacks Ukraine with a new hypersonic missile. Western leaders say it marks a dangerous new phase in the war. The Kremlin says it follows a decision by the White House to let Ukraine fire US missiles into Russian territory. So what could happen next? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. This week, new, more powerful weapons are being used by Russia and Ukraine as Europe's worst conflict since World War II enters what Poland's Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, calls a new phase. It's a war US President-elect Donald Trump says he will end in one day. Ukraine has fired American and Franco-British missiles onto Russian territory for the first time after Joe Biden gave the go-ahead weeks before he leaves office. Russia then hit the Ukrainian city of Dnipro with what it called a new hypersonic missile. The Oreshnik could potentially hit targets anywhere in Europe and the eastern United States. NATO and Ukraine will hold emergency talks on Tuesday. So what happens next? Could the fighting intensify, or might Trump really manage to end the war? We'll discuss all this and more with our guests shortly, but first this report from Laura Khan.
Russia's use of hypersonic missiles in Ukraine on Thursday has alarmed the West, with some political leaders saying it brings closer the threat of global conflict. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk is calling Russia's firing of its Oreshnik missile at the city of Dnipro a decisive phase in the war in Ukraine.
None of us knows the end of this conflict. We only know that it is currently taking on very dramatic dimensions.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin described the bombing as a test, saying it was in response to Ukraine firing US and British-made weapons into Russia.
I will add there are no means of counteracting such a missile, any means of intercepting it in the world today. They don't exist. And I will emphasize once again, we will continue testing the latest system.
While the missile could carry a nuclear warhead, some analysts downplayed that risk.
It's not to be overly feared. Russia has a very limited number of these. It's very experimental at this time. They're very expensive to make. And Putin has no desire to put a nuclear weapon on one of these missiles and launch it.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has not changed his pleas since the start of the war, again lobbying Western allies to send more advanced missiles.
That is why the world must sound serious in response, to make Putin really afraid of expanding the war and feel the real consequences of his actions.
The European Union Parliament President is backing Ukraine's use of longer-range missiles and is urging Germany to deliver more, something Chancellor Olaf Scholz has so far resisted. Britain and the US recently agreed to allow Ukraine to fire medium-range missiles they've supplied into Russian territory. Previously only for use in Ukraine, they were fired at targets in Russia for the first time last week. This was after the US accused Russia of a major escalation by bringing soldiers from North Korea to fight Ukrainian forces.
There are some 10,000 or so North Korean soldiers in the Kursk region.
And while US President Joe Biden has promised to provide more security assistance to Ukraine, President-elect Donald Trump says he will work directly with Putin and Zelensky to end the war when he enters the White House. He hasn't outlined how, but his President-elect J.D. Vance said it could include Russia keeping the territory it had taken. What's next for the conflict is unclear, but the alternatives are stark. More war, a further widening escalation, or a push back to the negotiating table. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our guests. In Odesa in Ukraine is Michael Bociurkiw, a global affairs analyst. From Moscow, we're joined by Pavel Felgenhauer, a Russian defense and military analyst. And in Berlin, Stephen Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe with the New York Times. Welcome back, everyone. Pavel, I'd like to begin with you, first of all. Russia hits a target in Ukraine with this Oreshnik missile. What are we supposed to read into the use of this new missile by Russia?
Attacking a target in Dnipro, you don't need such a long-range missile at all. This was actually really a test and a message to the West. The General Sergei Karakayev, who's the commander of the Russian Strategic Missile Force, says that these missiles can hit any target anywhere in Europe. And actually, these missiles, it was announced by President Putin that these missiles will be part of the strategic rocket force, not belonging to the army as tactical missiles belong to the army, like the Iskanders are in the Russian army, and America had Attack MS and now newer missiles too. So this is a semi-strategic, not strategic, but semi-strategic weapon aimed at primarily European states and targets, not at Ukraine. And this is a message, of course, is a political message primarily, that Russia now has these missiles, so similar to those that triggered the so-called Euro missile crisis of the 70s and 80s.
Stephen, what do you reckon? Is it a political message?
Well, I believe it is, and I believe Pavel Felgenhauer is right, as he almost always is. This was designed to try to intimidate the United States and the West. It was designed to warn Europe, particularly if a Trump administration pulls back a lot of American aid from Ukraine. Europe would be pressed to step up its aid. So I do think it was meant as a warning. It is also a function of the collapse of the intermediate range missile treaty, which banned these land-based missiles, but that's gone away. It is a new missile. It's an intermediate range missile, but a very speedy one. And like the Iskander, it can take a nuclear warhead as well as a conventional one. So I think the messaging is clear. I don't think it changes the war. It's meant to simply show to the West that Russia has farther steps up the escalatory ladder should it want to climb them.
Michael, Stephen says there it was supposed to be intimidatory. Did it intimidate in Ukraine? Is that the effect?
I wouldn't say so. I think people here have got used to all kinds of stuff coming from Russia. But I think what made this a bit of a difference is it travels really, really fast, something like 3 kilometers a second. And people in Dnipro described it with the force similar to an asteroid hitting. I think in the wider picture, this is part of the usual Russian political ballet to rattle people, to cause a bit of imbalance, and that it has done in Europe. But Donald Tusk has said that this is escalatory. Well, I would say to him, we've been in an escalation phase for a long time. The amount of time it took for the West to give high-powered kit or permissions to use missiles deeper inside Russia, and also the Biden administration hesitance to confront the aggressor straight on. The problem is when you allow your aggressor to take more aggressive steps like they did this week without any consequences, they will continue to do so. And from my point of view and that of many others, this is the first time in modern warfare that's happened. That's landed us in the sorry situation here in Ukraine where we are right now.
So for the benefit of our audience, let's explain why this missile is significant. So the Pentagon and the Kremlin say that the Ereshnik is an intermediate range missile. Now, these weapons were covered by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Donald Trump pulled the US out of it in 2019 when he was president. President Putin referred to that fact in a televised address on Thursday. Now, this treaty is distinct from the New START treaty that covers the use of ballistic nuclear weapons. Russia suspended its participation last year, but the US says it's still bound by its obligations. Pavel, how many of these Ereshnik missiles are there? How expensive are they, and how practical are they? Are they cost effective in that brutal calculation of cost versus damage caused?
Well, they'll be tested. I don't think that they'll be massively used in Ukraine because most likely it doesn't make much military sense to do so. They are saying that they're beginning production. It's a land mobile system. It's solid fuel. So I don't think that most likely Russia hardly has large amounts of them, but could produce. In the 70s, there were hundreds of similar Pioneer missiles produced and deployed in different parts of the Soviet Union. Of course, today's Russia is not the Soviet Union, so production most likely will be not as massive, but it's going to be a force. I mean, directly, specifically tailored mostly for Europe. So if there's a conflict in Europe, Russia does not need to fall back on strategic intercontinental missiles to hit anything there, but has a special class of it. But of course, most likely, like last time, there'll be American missiles appearing in Europe also of a similar, most likely class, which itself could be a very serious matter. It's because the time of arrival of such missiles is much smaller than intercontinental.
Stephen, is it significant that the US abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty when Trump was president? Does that matter to Putin now? That's why we've seen this being used now.
Well, the reason the US and NATO abandoned it was because Russia had ignored it for many years, and so it had become useless. It was inhibiting the Western armory, but not the Russian armory. That's why it fell apart, and now we're seeing the consequences, because as Pavel reminds us, and I covered them too, there were big rocket debates in the 80s over medium-range missiles, the so-called Pershing 2s and SS-20s, which threatened Europe, caused huge demonstrations, peace demonstrations, and in the end were banned by the intermediate range treaty that you just described. So I do think it's very important. And I do think it is a very important psychological tool Russia has in its arsenal to threaten Europe, in addition to the missiles it already has, like the Iskander, which can reach Berlin in, frankly, not very, maybe 10 minutes. This kind of missile would probably reach it in 2 minutes. But it is a threat, and it is meant to produce a political reaction.
Well, so Stephen, as well as being a threat and a psychological threat, does it bring the risk of direct confrontation between the US and Russia any closer? Does it make it closer?
I don't think it does, to be honest. Mr. Putin just declared that Russia's nuclear doctrine had changed, meaning that if Russia felt under threat, if I get this right, from third countries' arms being used against it, whether it was being used by that third country or by another country like Ukraine, then Russia would feel justified in responding with nuclear weapons if it were that serious. But again, this makes us very nervous, but I see no appetite on either side for a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, let alone a nuclear confrontation.
So Michael, Stephen there saying he doesn't see the appetite for a larger confrontation, but that the language has been more explicit from Russia, from Vladimir Putin, hasn't it? He said Russia is entitled to strike military facilities of countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities.
I agree with our two other panelists. I think that a lot of this is just bluster coming from Mr. Putin, as much for domestic consumption, again, painting Russia as the victim in all of this, as well as I said earlier, unrattling the West. But, people have to be reminded that it was Mr. Putin who had to invite these thousands of North Korean troops because they're basically operating on meat grinder mode on the front with Ukraine. An incredible 1,500 or so deaths a day, something like that in that area. And, you also have to wonder, in exchange for this assistance that he's had to get from not only North Korea, but also Iran, and to a certain extent China, what's being offered in return. This week, for example, we learned that Russia has been quietly sending millions of barrels of oil to North Korea. One wonders what else they're sending too, perhaps even nuclear technology. So a lot of different kind of balls in the air here, but I think that speech of Mr. Putin's was a reminder that there's not many red lines that they see, but they are limited by the impact this war has caused on their forces and on the morale of their people too, I think.
Pavel, is it just, as Michael suggests, bluster, or should we be taking these threats seriously?
Well, let's see, this is primarily a political weapon, this new aggression.
Okay.
It's not a weapon that will be, they're using it. It was used once in Ukraine, will be more kind of, if it's a test, but this is more tests than actually changing anything much on the battlefield. And as a political weapon, it's an important one. I believe that this is a message also to the United States, to the new administration coming in January. During his election, President Trump was speaking a lot about the threat of nuclear war and World War III. And right now, Putin is sending him additional arguments to use the threat of a possible World War III developing over the fighting in Ukraine, so that Trump maybe could impose or help impose a peaceful solution in Ukraine that's more to Russia's liking.
Stephen, do you think Putin has got the upper hand at the moment in the war? He's making on the ground some territorial gains. He's taking territory back in Kursk. He's taken other parts of eastern Ukraine. Trump's on his way back. Europe's tiring of the war. He's got North Korean troops, we're told. He's on the front foot.
I think he is on the front foot, but just a bit. I mean, it's not huge, but Russia is winning the war, but it's not a rapid win. I mean, the only real win would be if the front in Ukraine suddenly collapsed, which I don't see happening. And one of the things Biden also did, which we haven't mentioned, is he approved sending to Ukraine a lot of anti-personnel landmines, which presumably would help Ukraine defend its territory further against Russian advances. So the Russians are advancing. People are nervous about it. The hope is, at least my hope, personal hope, is that we get to some sort of sustainable ceasefire line that would allow real negotiations. But to me, it would require first that Mr. Putin believe he's gained as much as he's going to gain in Ukraine. And so it's time to stop and talk. I'm not sure he's at that point.
Well, Pavel, is Putin thinking he's close to the point where he's got to where he wants to be before he has to perhaps sit down and talk?
Well, the Kremlin has been saying all the time that they're ready to talk. I would believe that is the case, but of course the Russian position on what Russia wants is not really very acceptable at all for the Ukrainians, and vice versa. Also, I mean, right at present, any kind of solution of trying to find a magical formula would be most likely based on kind of freezing the front line into a ceasefire line like in Korea or in the Kashmir. But on what right now publicly, both Zelensky and Putin agree that they don't want a freeze. So trying to find such a formula would not be easy, though there is a momentum right now and internationally to try and end this conflict, because if no one seems capable of achieving an outright victory on the battlefield, well, let's call it a day and stop the killing and stop where we stand. But how to do that, how to find that formula, that will be not easy at all.
And Michael, that's Zelensky's fear, isn't it? That he might be forced to accept something he doesn't want to from Trump. Europe is tiring of the war. He's worried about that. At the moment, it's not going his way.
No, it isn't. And by the way, in response to that test missile being fired, the Ukrainians have reportedly put out the request for even something more powerful than the Patriot defense missile system. And that comes at a time when you're right, the West is tiring. I don't think it'll be easy for Mr. Zelensky to go to the negotiating table and say, we want everything back, 1991 lines, that we want all Russian troops out, and we want to go ahead with our bid for NATO. This is exactly what the Kremlin's demanding and what's been echoed by Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. I will tell you this, is that I think Mr. Zelensky and Western allies really have to do a better job of telling ordinary folks, their voters, their electorate, of what's happening in the bigger picture. And what I'm talking about is just a few blocks away from me, the Odesa port, where there's zero activity. I walked by there today and yesterday. This is a port that feeds the world, that sends wheat to markets all over the world, including to countries on the brink of starvation. When you add to that what Russia is reportedly doing in the Red Sea, providing targeting information to the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels to disrupt shipping traffic there, that's a big deal. And I think it fits into this picture of what Russia is doing, its hybrid war, reportedly cutting submarine cables, disrupting elections, poisoning opponents on foreign soil. That story needs to be put forward a lot more forcefully to get people on board on why Ukraine needs to be aided, why Mr. Putin needs to be pushed back.
So Pavel, Michael there says, that Putin has succeeded in frightening off the shipping around Odessa. Might there be a step up in the threats? We had this article from Sergei Karaganov, an influential security hawk in Russia. He said that Russia risks ripping defeat from the jaws of victory, and it's early and dangerous to relax. The fight is only beginning, he says.
Well, Mr. Sergei Karaganov is not that really influential in Russian decision-making, but he was making, yes, rather belligerent statements. That's true. Now, Ukrainian grain exports are still happening. They're not going maybe through Odessa, but they're going through Ismail and other ports on the Danube. So the grain is getting out. It's not really that bad. But yes, I would agree fully that, yes, this is not right now. If there is a momentum towards finding some kind of ceasefire agreement, some kind of like Korean situation, but that's not still very far away. It's hard to imagine how that will happen. And right now, both sides, even if we're going to a ceasefire, both sides will try and achieve something in the last moment, because if you take some kind of hill and it's a ceasefire, you hold that hill for some kind of number of years. So the fighting is not going to die down. It's going to intensify. That's a sure guess. Are we going into a ceasefire or not? In this regard.
All right. Well, Stephen, Putin, he'd be in a stronger position, wouldn't he, if he'd been able to deter the West from providing Ukraine with all the weapons it's been demanding. But he hasn't been able to do that, has he?
Well, no. But I do think with Trump coming in, there will be an effort on both sides to get as much territory as they possibly can. And Putin also, I think, has to be worried. I mean, Trump, wants to stop the war, and he may sacrifice Ukrainian interests to do that. But he may also push Putin to try to accept a deal that Putin doesn't like. And if Putin doesn't like it and says no, Trump may respond, as he often does, by blaming Putin and by throwing even more arms into Ukraine. So this is the unpredictability of Trump. It's not clear. Trump wants to take credit for ending Biden's wars, not that Biden started the Ukraine war, but under his administration, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And Trump, I think, would like to do that, but at not any cost. And it is important that he not look weak. So I think Putin has to worry about an offer from Trump that Putin won't accept, and Trump's response to that rejection.
Pavel, is there frustration in Moscow that the constant threats from Russia it took Europe and the US a long time to give Ukraine the weapons it was asking for, but it gave them in the end? Was there frustration? Is there frustration in the Kremlin that perhaps Ukraine hasn't been abandoned completely?
Oh, sure. Of course, Russia would want to see the Ukrainian regime isolated and then fall kind of into the Russian lap. It's well understood that most likely that won't happen. And right now, if maybe in the beginning, in 22, there were some ideas that, Ukraine is going to become a kind of a Russia-friendly country. Right now, it's understood apparently that Russia can have parts of it, can have some kind of guarantees on NATO membership. But that's more or less the thing. And what's really important for Moscow, I believe, is not which kind of village in Zaporozhye is controlled by whom. It's much more important, I would say, the sanctions relief, because sanctions are causing a lot of damage and the damage is growing. So any kind of deal, Russia would be looking forward to some kind of, at least, form of sanctions relief. And that's also not easy. It's hard to impose sanctions. It's harder still to take them down.
Very quickly, Michael, would Zelensky have to face up to the fact that he's going to have to make territorial concessions if he wants this war to end next year?
He may very well have to. I think Crimea is off the table. And frankly speaking, a lot of Ukrainians I talk to say parts of occupied areas of Donbass are so heavily bomb destructed. What can you possibly do with that? Although the symbolism, of course, of giving territory away is very bad. Very quickly, if I can, there's one more wild card left from the Russian side, and that could happen in the next hours and days. The temperature here is now near freezing. It's going to stay that way. And the Ukrainian energy system is in such bad shape right now that it wouldn't take much more for the Russians to level it much further. And that, according to the UN, could trigger a humanitarian crisis, which in turn could trigger another wave of asylum seekers to Europe, and that would be a big burden for Europe to take. So we have to watch for that as well, and that's something I think they will be very, very tempted to do, sorry to say.
All right, a fascinating point to end on. We're out of time. Thank you to all our guests, to Michael Bociurkiw, to Pavel Felgenhauer and Stephen Erlanger, and thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.